Ooh. Um, so basically what we're doing, just so you kind of know, is we did this with Neurosis. We've done this with a couple of other albums when an anniversary arrives, and we like to get a lot of good historical context from different people. We've gotten like a lot of journalists. I've reached out to guys from Sodom, and Scott Carlson from Repulsion is going to do something for the Venom thing. So we're just trying to kind of assemble a lot of really cool pieces. And then so I'm going to ask some questions kind of related to your experience with Venom, and kind of the influences it had on you as, with Hellhammer and Frost and all those kind of things. And then later on, we're actually going to be doing, this is going to happen in 2023. We're doing like an international kind of thrash series. We did an American thrash series a couple of years ago that people were big fans of. And one of the episodes is on like the Swiss scene. And so I kind of want to get some of your perspectives on what you thought of some of that stuff too at the end. So it's kind of two completely separate little groups of thoughts from Tom, if you will. So if that's cool with you.
All right.
All right, perfect.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got a chance to see you guys at Maryland Death Fest. That was great. The Triumph of Death set was fantastic. So
My God, the audience was manic. It was
yeah,
one of our best experiences ever.
it was fantastic. Yep, indeed.
Yeah,
So
we totally appreciate that.
no, no, and every time, I mean, I've seen you guys when you roll through, because I'm Mark and I are in Detroit. So whenever Triptychon rolls through Detroit and things like that, we always try and check you guys out. So, and then I don't know if you remember, but Mark did the graphic novel on you guys. Do you remember that, the Celtic Frost comic book?
Very much so.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
very much so.
So he told me to extend greetings. He couldn't be here for the interview, but he was like, "Yeah, tell
All right.
Tom." So all
All
right,
right.
cool.
Well,
Let's
thank you.
hit it. Oh, are you on a time crunch? Like, do you have like a half hour? Just whenever? Okay.
Absolutely.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. How did you discover Venom, and where were you at in your kind of musical and metal evolution when you first encountered them?
I was in a period that lasted several years where I was instinctively drawn towards heavier and darker metal music or heavy music. Um, I started from Black Sabbath in the 1970s as a young teenager, and I really it changed my life. I had never heard anything like this. I think I discovered Volume 4 in 1975 or 76. And once I had discovered this, of course, I wanted more of this. And Black Sabbath, of course, towards the end of the 70s, didn't become darker. Quite on the contrary. And so I was looking for other bands like that. I discovered UFO's Obsession album and so on. And then I stumbled upon Motorhead. I think it was the Bomber album. And a friend of mine who was in the punk scene, a very close friend of mine, introduced me to Discharge, which was eye-opening. So this I realized, wow, there's really radical metal and rock music out there. And then the new wave British heavy metal arrived, and I became a diehard fan of much of that music, Angel Witch and all that stuff. Uh, and with the drummer of my first band, at Grave Hill, I went to London for a few days to buy. We scratched together all our little money to go to London and buy new wave British heavy metal singles, and we went to a record store, and I didn't know Venom existed. Out of the blue, I stood in front of that 7-inch single in League with Satan. I'd never heard of the band, but I liked, of course, the pentagram on it, and I turned the single around, and there was this radical photo. And nowadays every black metal band has photos like this, but back then there was no band with photos like that. And I was like, my God, I have no idea how this band is, but they look like a cross between metal and punk, and I just had to buy it. The record store didn't have any record player, so I didn't know what I was in for. But that's in July 1981 in London. That's how I first stumbled upon Venom. Then I had to wait until I was back home to listen to it. And once I put it on, I was like, wow, the world will never be the same again.
So when Welcome to Hell and black metal came out as part of the new wave of British heavy metal, did it did it stand out right away as being immediately different to you and your metal listening friends, like Venom, compared to say like Diamond Head or Angel Witch?
Well, of course, by after the first 10 seconds of listening to that Venom single, the first Venom single, we knew they sound like they're part of the new British heavy metal, but they're completely different than any other band of that movement. Even different than the very dark early Satan single, or the very early Angel Witch material, Baphomet and stuff, which was also for the time quite radical. But I mean, you listen to Venom, and they were basically closer to Discharge than to heavy metal. And we also, at the same time I discovered that single, I discovered Kerrang magazine, the first issue of Kerrang magazine. I went home and got a subscription to the magazine, and in Kerrang they said that the Venom album will come out at the end of 1981. And of course we were dying. We went to the record store like every day to ask, is it out yet? Because we knew, like you said, we knew this was a different genre, a different era of metal, and we couldn't wait. We wanted to have more than just the two tracks on the single.
Absolutely. So, like, I guess once you finally got Welcome to Hell, and then a year later with black metal, what were some of the more musical and philosophical impacts that these records had on you, both personally and on some of the ideas that you were starting to formulate with what eventually became kind of Hellhammer?
Well, you have to realize that I didn't grow up in London or in New York. I grew up in a farm village in the Swiss countryside. So we were quite isolated. We were roaming all the available record stores in any town or city nearby that we could reach, and gathered our musical knowledge from there. But we were still quite isolated. And the immediate effect of Venom was that it confirmed that we weren't the only ones who were looking for ever heavier music, for more radical music. It confirmed that this also existed in other people, and since Venom were a little ahead of us, a little older, and had started earlier, they were basically a beacon for us. Yes, this can be done, and yes, it can even be recorded and released, even though rec companies at the time were looking for AC/DC or Dio type music. But we realized, well, there is record companies who support this, not just in the punk scene. And we just knew heavy metal had found a different platform. But you also have to realize that pretty much everybody in the metal scene that I knew here in Switzerland, all the metal fans, they all hated it. They said that Venom is no longer music, that it goes too far. He can't even sing, and they can't play, and this and that. And they listen to their Judas Priest and Rainbow and everything, which is fair enough. But I didn't mind that they were technically limited. I was drawn to Venom because of their radicalness.
So the rawness, and it was that kind of certainly an influence then on what you were about to do with kind of Hellhammer, and even some of the imagery of how they dressed and things like that? Or were you drawing from other things to get that rawness, like Discharge and Motorhead? Or did that come through? Can you hear me, Tom?
No,
Oh,
you were cut out for a while
oh,
there. Could you repeat the
yeah,
question,
I'll
please?
repeat that. Sorry about that. Yeah, basically, I was just asking, like, so was it the rawness and some of the way that the band, the imagery that you saw, how they dressed and things like that, were those things that you immediately kind of absorbed into what you were kind of doing with Hellhammer, or were there other influences beyond that?
No, it was everything and every level that you could see in this record. It was the imagery, it was the lyrics, it was the raw production, it was the songwriting, it was the audaciousness. Uh, I mean, the whole Venom concept was so preposterous. We loved it.
Yeah.
You have to realize, I mean, Venom were really young, and we were really young, and we were full of testosterone. We were rebellious. It was also a very different time. It was a time when in Switzerland there was a lot of youth unrest against the government at the time, and the government sent out police to shoot at the young people with rubber bullets.
Wow.
And above all of this was the Cold War, with the constant threat of nuclear escalation. And this darkness and this radicalness just completely connected to our frame of mind in this situation.
Sure.
And we love, I mean, we absorbed everything in Welcome to Hell.
What do you see as the legacy of that record, both not just for you, but in terms of like the future genres that were about to sort of emerge? Is that record appropriately given the credit that it deserves for like opening up the doorways to, all these other subgenres, or because you were right there, so like you would be a good person to sort of estimate the influence that record had.
Well, we are the perfect example. I was in a band that tried to emulate the new wave British heavy metal, and once we heard Discharge and Venom, I changed that band. I created Hellhammer because we wanted to do something like that. So yes, that credit is absolutely appropriate. The first two Venom albums changed our scene forever. There would be no black metal, there would be no thrash metal, there would be no speed metal, or at least not in its present shape, if
Mhm.
it wasn't for the two Venom albums. They were really the first band uh, uh, that took it to that level. Motorhead was basically like a demo for Venom. But Venom were even more radical, and Venom had a lot of punk in their approach too. And this combination, of course, is what modern extreme metal, the roots of modern extreme metal. So yes, of course, Venom deserves that credit,
Sure.
regardless of what they did later. But that stands forever.
Yeah. So I guess, being that this is the 40th anniversary of black metal, when that record came out, you had obviously absorbed In League with Satan, the single, and bought Welcome to Hell. Was it immediate when black metal came out that they had sort of upped the ante in terms of darker themes and scarier sounds, and just it was a little bit more, I want to say serious, but it just seemed like it was more less Nawabum and more like Venom, maybe that's kind of the wrong way of putting it, but did it kind of jump out to you like, oh man, they've leveled up with this record?
Well, I have to say, everybody in Hellhammer at the time, we loved old black metal. We there again, we went to the record store like every day when we found out they would come out. We went every day and asked, "Did you receive it yet?" Everybody bought a copy. We ran home. We listened to it, and we loved it, and we loved the whole presentation and so on. But there was also a strange underlying feeling of realizing this band is now developing and becoming more professional, which of course seems to be a good thing. But I personally, to this day, slightly prefer Welcome to Hell because it's more raw.
Mhm.
And I know Venom themselves are quite unhappy with that Welcome to Hell is so raw. I think they're for them probably the ultimate early Venom album is Black Metal. But to me, Welcome to Hell, because of its radicalness and because of its closeness to the punk approach, is the more important album. Hellhammer was much more influenced by the first album than the second. But again, I have to say we're talking about details. We
Yeah.
of course the first albums are an entity, and black metal was more of the same, slightly more accomplished, but they were still radical versus some of the later albums. They were still absolutely radical, and that even at the time that black metal was released, no other band could touch them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you if you had a personal preference between the two, but I think you answered that. So, um, so I guess, I think we've hit on the what I was going to ask about, why you think the records are so influential to like you guys, Merciful Fate, Bathory, Metallica, Slayer. Um, Anything else you want to sort of add just in terms of like the magic ingredient that Venom has that seems to, grab bands like Slayer, that grabbed you guys, that grabbed Korthon up in Sweden, like besides the imagery, besides the rawness, anything else that there was like a mystical kind of power that you were drawing from, or like I said, a magic ingredient of some sort?
It was magical because due to the simple fact that at the time there was no internet, there was no Wikipedia, there was no YouTube. The only information one could gather as a diehard fan of Venom was what was on the back of the album, what was in the lyrics, and the few very brief articles that were to be found in Kerrang magazine.
Yeah.
Everything else we had to piece together in our minds, and of course in our minds that band had taken on a magical, mystical shape. We took it very serious. We Doing the first two albums, we believe they are really like that. They are Satanists. They mean it, and that makes them so radical. And so this magic element, this element of not knowing and thinking this band is so mysterious. This band is full of It's an enigma, this band. Where did they learn to play this music? What gave them these ideas?
Yeah.
Um, that took
Like
on
an
a
incantation or
gargantuan
something.
importance. Yeah, you had to, you had to complete it in your head, and being being similarly radical. All of us pictured something completely supernatural, I guess.
Sure.
And the second thing that I think is like you said, that why they became an influence on Bathory and Merciful Fate and us. And I think the second significant thing is that Venom were absolutely fearless. Everybody back then tried to have a really good production and tried to be proper and professional, and Venom didn't seem to give a toss about that. They wanted to be radical, and they just they did it. It was obvious from listening to that music in the context of the other music available at the time that they didn't give a shit about traditions and conventions. They were completely fearless,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the most significant influences. If you have to understand that we're talking about young men, both Venom and all the followers, young men full of testosterone, a bit of machoism, wanting to be recognized, wanting to prove that in spite of being young, we are men. We want to be heard. We want to be seen. We want to prove our place in the world. And Venom was just perfect for this juvenile attitude, because to us they were like, wow, look at them. They look evil and they're fearless and they go out there. And of course, all of us follow-up bands wanted to do the same.
Sure. Well, and I think too, like the way that you carried not just Hellhammer, but then into Frost and Triptychon, how you've kind of taken that fearless attitude to experimentation and to breaking down barriers and trying out ideas that other bands in your same scene were kind of scared to probably push into those dimensions. And so it's interesting that that's an aspect that you kind of saw and drew from with a band like Venom, you know?
Well, of course, Venom were ahead of us by a year or two. But of course, there was other people around the globe who had a similar radical frame of mind.
Mm-hmm.
People of Slayer or people of Merciful Fate and so on. And once we all saw that gate, that it was possible to open that gate, I think we all drew inspiration from that. We're like, okay, they proved it's possible. They proved you can find a rec company. They proved you can find a market. We want to do this too.
So
And
it's
and it basically for us all who were of a similar mindset, that there was a band who was a little ahead, because basically they were the flag bearers and we looked up to them. We're like, okay, we want to join them.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. The idea of like creating almost like an underground internet before that something like that existed, and that Venom was kind of the framework for that. That's a cool way of I hadn't really thought of that. But one of the things I teach a rock and roll history class, and like I talk a little bit about metal, and we get into the birth of extreme metal. And sometimes like when I play, like early, Venom for them, the kids are kind of like, what's the big deal about this? Like, because they've heard so much more extreme stuff now, right? And I said, well, at the time, you got to
Of course, yeah.
understand, nobody heard anything like this. Nobody heard anything that was this raw or whatever. So there's sometimes a hard band to put into context for people unless you were there in 81, 82, 83, watching that trajectory.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about heavy metal history in this context. I think Venom, more than any other band, also defined the point where heavy metal began to develop subsections. Until Venom, most of us in most of the metal fans that I knew, they listened to Motorhead and but also maybe Foreigner
Mm-hmm.
and everything in between, AC/DC, and that was normal. You could listen to a wide variety of metal from heavy to more commercial, and you were a metal fan. That's it. But then Venom came out, and a lot of metal fans didn't understand this or didn't like it. And you could also read it in magazine that metal journalists who had a long history of listening to metal said, "Oh, this is not music, and this is shambles," and so on. And so that's really when it started to divide, and there became what later became like the black metal scene or the extreme metal scene,
Yeah.
and Venom were so extreme that it was not listenable to all the metal fans, and thus started the extreme metal scene that
Yeah.
distanced itself from all the rest. They were really the root of that.
Yeah, that's really well put. Yeah, the divisiveness, the path splitting was with Venom. Absolutely. On a personal level, are there favorite songs of yours like that you still get nostalgic for from either of those first two records that you just always are like, man, that's just, brings that warm kind of you takes you back to your youth days.
Well, I do understand that when you say young people think it's not extreme, but for me, of course, having lived through that, when I listen to Venom's early albums, I'm instantly back in that place. I This was so important that it's like ingrained in me. It's like a movie, and I can listen to the entire first album, and I'm right back. I smell the rehearsal room of Hellhound,
Yeah.
and I know exactly the darkness in the rehearsal room and how we made it look dark and evil. It's instantly there, and I love still the entire first album. And from the second album, probably my favorite songs are "The Hell I'm Back," or "Leave Me in Hell," and also "Raise the Dead." Even though I prefer the demo version of "Raise the Dead" because it's even more underground.
Yeah. More raw. Yeah.
But I mean, there isn't really a bad song on the first two Venom album, is it? Is there?
Sure. No, absolutely. What about At War with Satan, Possessed, and any of the other output? Did you kind of follow the band beyond black metal at all, or were you kind of onto your own things by that point?
We were on to our own things at that point, and the more accomplished we became in our own path, I'm not talking about technical
Hmm.
accomplishments, but the more we gained control over what we wanted to do, the more critical our stance became towards Venom, which is of course nonsense because we wouldn't have been anywhere without Venom.
But
But
you were
of course, there
young.
was also an underlying, yeah, there was an underlying feeling of competition,
Yeah.
absurdly, even though Venom gave us our start. And we had met Venom by that time. We met Venom in late '83 or early '84 when they had a press conference in Switzerland. And I have to say, this experience was extremely demystifying. Um, they 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 weren't cool or extreme at all, and it really stripped the magic off of it. They came with colorful clothes and acted very childish, and we were hugely disappointed that they weren't like they were on the back of Welcome to Hell.
You thought they were
Um,
beings of pure evil.
Having said that, yeah, I mean, who am I to speak? Looking at Cold Lake later, so uh, we have to take this with a grain of salt, but that's the way we felt at the time.
Yeah.
And then At War with Satan was released, and I have to say we were quite disappointed by the presentation. The concept sounded so fantastic of that album, but the execution to us personally was a letdown after the first two really radical albums. This cover, we always thought that the cover that we later used for To Megatherion would have been perfect for At War with Satan, for example.
Hmm. Yeah. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, it's weird because they're a band, that obviously so much attention gets put on those first two records, and even sometimes, people talk about the title track of At War, and then it's almost like the rest is kind of forgotten. But I've, in putting together this episode and stuff, I've kind of gone back and listened to some of that, and there's some songs that are kind of, I think, nice in hindsight, but I can imagine that hearing them in 83, 84, it didn't match maybe the intensity or the energy that you got from those first two records. And so I can completely understand why a lot of people left Venom at that point and kind of went elsewhere.
Well, you have to understand, Venom really reinvented metal, and they created a whole new genre. But it was very fast-living times. By the time At War with Satan came out, the scene had already changed so dramatically, and there was many other bands going the same path. And out of the blue, Venom weren't without competition. There was a lot of very good competition around, And it, in a way, I know it sounds arrogant. It's not meant arrogantly. I'm just trying to analyze it. In
Hmm.
a way, it seemed like they missed the train a little bit.
Hmm.
I mean, Slayer appeared and so on, and out of the blue, Venom no longer seemed so extreme. Whereas when they first appeared, there was nobody, and they reigned supreme. And that's a bit of a shame because we all wanted them to keep on reigning. And then in February '84, we saw their first European tour, and Metallica was opening, and all of us were diehard Venom fans, but we all had to admit Metallica blew them off stage, even though Venom had a gargantuan stage show and Metallica had like nothing. But Metallica kicked their asses, and we were all blown away. We were like, "Wow, these completely unknown Californians are actually more extreme than Venom in a way. They have the energy that Venom used to have, and we're only talking about the development of like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
That's how fast the scene moved at the time.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you go from like 80, 81 to like 86 just for a 5 year stretch. And you look at that and the
Yeah,
development of the history of metal and all these different subgenres, and it's like lightning speed, you know. It's almost
yeah,
like the mid 60s too. You know, you take like rock and roll from like 65 to 70, and it's like, whoa, what happened? You know, metal kind of went through
yeah.
its version of that, I feel like, you know.
Yes, and I have to repeat. I mean, I'm not saying that from the high horse. We all wanted Venom to continue like as they impressed us in the beginning. We it's not meant in a ridiculing manner. We lamented that Venom were no longer so extreme, and that in their interviews they were acting actually very childishly. Some of their interviews in Kerrang magazine stripped also helped to strip away the magic. We didn't want this.
Yeah.
We wanted nothing more than them being radical.
Yep.
But then for some reason it sometimes almost seemed like a theater, and for those who had taken them seriously, that was a bitter pill in a way. We didn't want that.
Sure. Well, I feel like, yeah, you guys and you know what Corthon was doing with Bathory and stuff, you guys
Yeah.
seem to be a more serious version of Venom, whereas like a lot of, like you said, Venom was more like theater or something like that, you know, and that demystification happened. And I can imagine where you guys were very committed to what you were doing, and it almost seemed like Venom was just doing it for kind of like shock value or show or something like that, you know.
Well, look, everybody's entitled to their own version of heavy metal and their own approach, and I'm perfectly fine with this. And of course, now with 59 and after 40 years in the metal scene, I can analyze this much more correctly. And I think it also has to do with the UK approach. I know a lot of those bands personally by now, and I know a lot of decisions are made in the pub in a very relaxed atmosphere, maybe with some alcohol and so on.
Yeah.
Whereas Martin and I, being completely abstinent, and we were like overthinking everything and taking everything totally seriously, and at least for a while there.
Hmm.
And of course, that was a mismatch. But we didn't know all of these things back then. Everybody was very young, including Ven. You know.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. Any other, before we move off of Venom, any other fun sort of memories or stories of Venom? I know you said you met them and things like that. Is you know, anything before we switch to the Swiss scene?
Well, during the high times of Venom, like around the first album or between the first and the second album, when they really reigned supreme in our minds. Um, we lived in tiny farm villages out in the countryside, and our rehearsal room was in a neighboring farm village that was even smaller, and we had to walk to go to rehearse. We had to walk to a forest and through fields, like in some horror movie. And in one of those fields, there was a tiny little wooden shed. I mean, maybe 20 foot by 20 foot, really small wooden shed that was halfway falling apart. We always said that's probably the rehearsal room of Venom. We couldn't we imagined this is exactly how it must be. They're like in nowhere land in near a forest in a tiny shed and making their satanic rituals in there. So every time we walked by, they were like, "Wow, this is like Venom's rehearsal room." and we made up all of these sceneries in our heads. And a few years ago, I actually went to see, but unfortunately, that shed has been torn down. It was just a childish little thing how we rationalized how Venom must exist.
We did the same thing because I'm of obviously the next generation. In the early 90s when we first discovered, I was in high school when Norwegian black metal and all this stuff was happening, and we would look at these images of these bands in the forest with swords and things like that. And it was pre-internet, so of course you were like, who are these people? Are they living in the woods? Do they really like fight with swords and shields and wear the corpse paint and all, so it's funny. So I think it's a generational thing. And maybe now with the internet, a lot of that's demystified because like everybody can just investigate and learn about who these bands are and things. So I think there is something like that was kind of lost, the magic of some of the weirder parts of heavy metal up
Absolutely.
until the internet.
I know in times where every band has their own coffee line and stuff, it's no longer no longer so underground and mystical, is it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in some ways that's probably good, and in other ways it's bad. It just depends on what angle you're looking at it. So
Of course, I mean every period has its justification, and but it's also nice to be slightly nostalgic at times.
yeah, absolutely. I know when first time I met Venom actually was at Milwaukee Metal Fest in '97, and we were backstage. We had press passes or something, and we were backstage, and it was Danny Filth's birthday party because Cradle of Filth and Venom were both headlining then. And we were eating birthday cake with Venom, and they were like just nice and kind of drunk and like whatever, kind of like when you met them. And I was like, oh, these guys were like the scary godfathers of like extreme metal, and they just seemed like real nice casual guys. And I was just fresh out of high school, so like I was still scared of metal like guys because I didn't really know who they really were. And the more I met them, I was like, oh, they're just normal people. And there's nothing wrong with
Exactly.
that. But at the same time, if
No,
you
no, no.
want them to be like these scary guys living in a shack, they're not quite that guys. So
That's a very valid point, especially in light of certain things that certain Scandinavian bands have done and are doing. I'd rather prefer Venom being harmless
yeah,
than be people being killed because they're homosexual or whatever, you know.
yeah,
I'd rather have Venom being demystified
yeah.
than criminals. What can I say?
Yeah, no, it's like some of the stuff that obviously happened there is it's almost like they were living some of those Norwegian bands were living like the wrestling gimmick too much. They believed their characters too much and took it too seriously.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, well, to switch gears real quick, I guess on a different front, kind of I'm really really digging into your brain today to go back to the nostalgic past. Um, can you kind of describe what the Swiss kind of Central European metal scene was like when you guys were first starting out in general? I know you obviously a small town, but was there any cohesive anything that was kind of happening there, or were you guys kind of alone?
There was quite a lot of bands in the Swiss scene, and I have to say Swiss scene in quotation marks. There wasn't really much of a scene, but there was a lot of bands practicing in basements here and there in these villages, and we went to see as many as we could in little tiny shows or in the rehearsal room. But the sad reality is that most of them try to sound either like Deep Purple or like Crocus, because Crocus was at the time the only Swiss band that had some measure of success outside of Switzerland.
Mhm.
So it was very conservative, and there was really no innovation going on when we started. The real scene that we encountered started in Germany.
Okay.
France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, all these countries had scenes. We got the demos from there, we got singles from there, we got albums from there, and there was tons of underground bands that impressed us. There was a compilation, I think, from Holland or Belgium called Metal Clogs, which is an odd name, but there was four bands on there, and they were quite heavy, quite dark, quite underground, things like that. Totally impressed us. But in Switzerland, unfortunately, it was very backward, and I guess people were much more innovative when it comes to the financial sector in Switzerland than
Sure.
when it comes to musical innovation.
So I guess alongside Hellhammer and Frost, were there any other bands around that time in the early to mid '80s from Switzerland that were causing any waves before we get to say like Coroner, or no?
Not really in the first half of the 80s. And even the original Corner, which was originally a five-piece band, they basically played far more commercial music.
Gotcha.
But starting in 85, halfway through the 80s, some people in the Swiss scene started waking up, and Corner were one of those bands, and also started playing heavier, thrashier. But the first 5 years of the 80s, no, there was nothing. I'm not saying that to make us bigger than we were, but I mean, I was there. There was nothing, and we were actually ridiculed in Switzerland for playing this kind of music. And I'm not saying ridiculed by normal people. I'm telling we were ridiculed by metal fans. And that's how isolated this kind of music was in the first half of the 80s in Switzerland.
Sure. So when you get to Coroner, where do they sort of fit into the equation and story? Because they're even kind of connected to you guys, correct? With him being a guitar tech and or doing some work with Frost to some extent.
Well, we were friends with the original Corner, the five-piece Corner, and then they fell apart. And the drummer Marky reformed them into a three-piece that was far heavier, doubtlessly influenced by us. And I'm not saying that arrogantly, but Marky and I were very close friends at the time and hung out all the time. And I know Marky was also into punk and into Venom and things like that. And I guess he reformed Corner to do something like Hellhammer or Celtic Frost. And he was very lucky. By that time, it was a little easier to find musicians to play that heavy. We had a much harder time in Hellhammer. And it just so happened that we needed a road crew for various concerts, and then our first US tour in the summer of '86. And I had helped the newly formed three-piece Corner in the studio. I had co-produced their demo. I had written the lyrics, and they couldn't find a singer, so I did the lead vocals on the demo, and then I helped them shop the demo to record companies. And they kind of repaid us by Marky becoming our drum tech and Tommy becoming my guitar tech for quite a while.
Yeah.
Of course, it also had benefits for them because at every concert they were with Celtic Frost as our crew. They were able to network with the people that we knew, and I went on stage with Corner T-shirts. We handed out Corner demos and so on. So it wasn't just work for them; it also helped them to get a foothold in the scene.
Do you kind of look at their sort of evolution and success kind of like a proud metal parent almost in a way where you're like, oh, like you kind of help give them a little bit of a push and kind of watch them sort of grow and evolve and become more technical and change and stuff?
Initially, I did, and then there was an interview sometime a few years after the demo when they had already released one or two albums, and then in the interview they said, "Well, we're taking the throne of Swiss extreme metal away from Celtic Frost,"
Ooh,
and I didn't find that so funny, of course.
yeah,
But it was probably the same effect as we had with Venom a few years earlier. First
yeah.
they are your parents, and then you become competitive yourself.
Hmm.
And of course, we our friendship actually survived this eventually, and we are still friends to this day.
Well, that's good to hear. Do you have any opinions on like favorite records from them or anything that you've been like maybe the most impressed since they kind of became what a lot of people thought of as like I guess quote unquote the Swiss, thrash scene, because you guys were really
Yeah,
doing your own
well,
thing way outside of thrash.
I obviously really like the first album, and I also like Grin. I think Grin is actually quite an accomplishment for that band. You could really see how they progress from album to album. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a record that I've recently reappreciated. I saw them actually perform. Speaking of Maryland, they played Grin or one of the songs from Grin, one of the longer songs at Maryland Death Fest, and I was like, "Whoa, this is a great song!" And I went back and really, because that record often gets kind of slagged, right? It kind of was like, oh, that's where Coroner made a misstep or something. But in a lot of ways, it's one of the more interesting things I think they ever did.
Exactly, exactly. And Corner, exactly, Corner tried to be different. They weren't just a straightforward thrash metal band. They always tried to be a slightly different with their lyrics, with their compositions, and that's why I think Grin actually fits them. It suits them.
Yeah. What about like Messiah and later Samael and any of the sort of others that kind of emerged from the Swiss scene later? Did you follow them very closely, or were you kind of off in your own sort of universe with Frost by that point? Or
Well, unfortunately, I had some insight into the personalities of Messiah in one way or another, and that's why I found it very difficult to take them serious. Samuel, of course, I have to hand it to them. They developed really their own style, and also were another Swiss band that has some influence in Scandinavia. And coming from Switzerland, that's not an easy task, and one needs to respect them for that.
cool. Cool. Yeah, nice. Well, any were there any other bands like of when people are like looking at the Swiss kind of metal history that maybe go unsung? Because obviously you guys and Corner are probably the two most often mentioned bands. Crocus, obviously, in the more commercial metal sort of scene. But was there like a gem that was always floating around that you kind of wish had gotten like bigger or more attention than what they got? Or
Well, it's maybe not strictly metal, but the Young Gods
ah,
to me and Martin were a hugely important band because they too tried to go their own path. They didn't accept industry conventions and tried to develop their own music. And much like Celtic Frost, they also had new wave influences, avant-garde influences. Yet at the same time, were quite a dark band, quite an intense band.
mhm.
And Martin and I always looked up to that very much, and we kind of felt a kinship with them artistically, even though it's not straight metal or thrash metal. But that's really a band I have to mention.
Sure. Yeah, they're great. I forget. I always forget that they're from Switzerland sometimes. So, but well, Tom, I really do appreciate this. This is awesome, and we'll be able to use this for a couple of episodes. And I'm hoping down the road that we might do this again, but talk a little bit more about some Celtic Frost and Hellhammer history as we do an anniversary episode for you guys. I think in the next couple of years, if you're up
All
for it,
right.
I hope so.
Very much so. This was very pleasant and also interesting for me. So I'm up for it anytime.
Perfect. Well, I really do appreciate it because I think your wisdom and your perspective will give us a little bit of extra oomph that we're kind of looking for. And so I'll let you
I'm a
know.
bit I'm a
Oh,
bit
go ahead.
skeptical when it comes to my wisdom, but I'll talk to you anytime.
Hey, it's all, yeah, exactly. It's all context. So, but I will let you know certainly when we post the episode and it
All
should be
right.
fun. All right. We'll take care and have a
All right.
you guys don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but have a wonderful week anyways. So,
Thank you very much.
all right, take care,
Thank you.
Tom. Yeah, talk soon.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.